The year 1963 was pivotal for the message. A large part of what message believers are trained to believe originated during or after 1963. William Branham claimed to have opened the 7 seals described in the book of Revelation in the year 1963. In 1963, he claimed to have been visited by 7 angels. He preached the token, a very popular sermon among his followers in 1963. Conduct, order, and doctrine of the church. Branham's instructions for his cult following, also called church order, was preached in 1963. I will never forget when my family moved back to Jeffersonville in the mid-1990s. In a casual conversation with another message believer, I quoted the prophet to make a point. Jokingly, he said, "Was that before or after 1963, brother?" Some of the sects in the message believe that Branham's 1963 to 1965 sermons are inspired, while they place far less emphasis on the sermons before 1963. Before the sermons were rebranded and resold in MP3 format, some families I knew only owned the sermons that were preached after 1962. Either the hundreds of cassette tapes took up too much space or the families couldn't afford to purchase the entire collection. They were simply not as important to some people. When Roy E. Davis warned America that war was inevitable, his words could not have been more prophetic. The Klan leader had been stirring up anger and hatred from Texas to Florida and everywhere in between. His arrest and fingerprinting, however, created new risks for those connected to him. Davis had a lengthy trail of criminal activity, from Texas to Georgia, Tennessee to Kentucky, Indiana to Arkansas to California, and back to Texas, where the circle started once more. In declassified FBI documents, it becomes clear that Roy Davis was already being tracked by the federal government. And when John F. Kennedy was elected president, this would have made Roy Davis a classified public enemy of the state. Kennedy was elected with a promise to the oppressed African American community. He would create equal opportunity for all mankind by the stroke of the president's pen. With Kennedy's election began an inquiry into all terroristic white supremacy groups. Davis's original Knights of the Ku Klux Klan was no exception. The OKKK was systematically posing a threat to the United States economy, while using physical violence to silence supporters of civil rights, all while touting itself as an anti-communist Christian association. Though it is heavily redacted and many names are hidden, the focal point of the FBI's investigation is clear. The Imperial Grand Dragon, Roy Davis, had organized his forces to create pressure against anyone or anything that promoted equality. Even interracial television programs were being targeted by the Klan's strategy of coercion towards white supremacy. I thought back to the statements that William Branham made in his public sermons against these television programs. Looking at it through the lens of white supremacy and discrimination, however, his statements sounded entirely different. Branham spoke against I Love Lucy, an interracial comedy. Civil rights supporter Elvis Presley was depicted in a 1960 movie, Flaming Star, which made a political statement about mixing race and racial equality. During multiple sermons, William Branham spoke harshly against Elvis Presley. Not only his person, but even his first name. The use of the name Elvis for a baby born to a family in the message was not permitted. Meanwhile, support for civil rights was quickly growing in the South. With the support of President John F. Kennedy, civil rights leaders now had the protection of military police. January 1, 1963 marked the 100-year anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation freeing African American slaves. Martin Luther King Jr. started a campaign asking President Kennedy for a second Emancipation Proclamation on the anniversary of the first. Shortly before the anniversary, in September of 1962, protests erupted at Ole Miss in Jackson, Mississippi. White supremacists began protesting the enrollment of James Meredith, a black U.S. military veteran. White supremacists were activated on campus, protesting the presence of an African American in the university. These protests turned violent. It became dangerous for African Americans to live in Jackson, simply for having a different color of skin. Convoys of military troops were sent into Jackson to restore law and order, and scenes from the school looked just like scenes of war. White supremacists had become militarized. William Branham publicly blasted the African Americans for this event, speaking through both sides of his mouth. He said he supported freedom, but said the colored people were selling their birthrights. Branham said that he supported James Meredith, but took the side of segregation. According to Branham, he had plenty of schools he could go to. When Martin Luther King Jr. pressed Washington for a second emancipation, he ignited the fuse that would explode into war. As the days grew nearer to the 100-year anniversary, lines were drawn in the sand. 100 years had passed since slavery was abolished, yet the nation was still divided by racial segregation. Churches in the North prepared for January 1st by uniting in support of equality. Catholic and Protestant churches alike joined together against segregation. Meanwhile, white supremacists in the South were preparing for the inevitable militant response from Washington. 166 United States Marshals were injured in the riots at Ole Miss, which sent a clear message to Washington: war is coming. William Branham himself prepared by taking his children out of school in Indiana and transplanting them to Tucson, Arizona, far out of harm's way. 2 days before the anniversary of slavery ending, Branham announced the move in a sermon to his Jeffersonville congregation. But he also announced that he wasn't planning to stay with his family. He said his plans were to become mobile. Roy Davis's sect of the Klan prepared by stockpiling weapons of war under the name Louisiana Rifle Association in Shreveport. But the FBI was not aware of this connection until August of 1963. Roy Davis and his associates were now armed for war against the government. Learning about the events leading up to Branham's migration to Tucson raised many questions for me. We were told that it was a quote-unquote spiritual move, yet it seemed more like a strategic one. Looking at the family photos, it almost seemed as though the family had decided to leave the message. William Branham preached firmly against shorts, yet his son was wearing them. Exposed shoulders and knees were forbidden for women, yet his daughters dressed according to the current fashion. Now that I knew about the Ku Klux Klan's stockpile of weapons, it was hard not to think about the prophet's own collection. He claimed to be a simple hunter, but he had more rifles than any man that I knew. Many of them were hunting rifles, as if he needed that many, but he also had handguns, many of them. When he was alive, very few of his followers had privilege of seeing inside his luxurious 1964 den, and only his close associates knew about the large number of weapons that he owned and carried. He had stockpiles of weapons in cases, and weapons for concealed carry, everything from hunting rifles to military-grade weapons. He could have gone on 100 hunting trips and never had time to get familiar with all of his weapons. In today's version of the cult following, Branham's den and his weapon cache are considered to be a monument in the message. But when he transplanted his family to Tucson, his followers had no idea about the number of weapons that he owned and carried. I knew that I would never get the answer to my question as why the prophet had so many weapons. So instead, I began to focus back to his statement that he made just before the turn of the new year. I'm going to Tucson to establish my family and school and then become a wanderer. There were a lot of sermons preached in 1963, the year many consider to be pivotal in civil rights history. Most of them were in Tucson, Phoenix, or Jeffersonville. But these were only the locations of the speeches that we had access to hear. They accounted for his revival series and Sunday services in his home and affiliated churches. If Branham did start traveling as he claimed, either the sermons were not available or the trip was not for religious reasons. Looking over the index of transcripts, including dates and locations, I found sermons preached in Phoenix and a few nearby cities. There were also sermons preached in Jeffersonville and Chicago to the latter rain crowd. Except for a revival series in New York, Branham really didn't wander that much. I began to wonder why he had to travel back and forth from Tucson to Jeffersonville, especially when his sermons were recorded and also broadcast between churches by telephone. But then I started to think about the gaps of time between services and his statements to the crowd before leaving to wander. During these gaps, he claimed to witness supernatural events. I wondered, did Branham travel to the places that he claimed when he preached those sermons?